Hello friends, and welcome back to Dungeon Design in Zelda. Since we've now completed the entire catalog of 3D games, as promised, we're back to break down the 2D entries in the series. And what better place to start than the very beginning, Zelda 1 on the NES. I'm also going to be discussing every dungeon in this one video instead of dividing them all up, just because while this game does lay down the groundwork that the series would adhere to, there just isn't enough to talk about for each one individually, so we can do them all at once here. But before we get into the actual dungeons, a few pre-dungeon things to get out of the way as usual. For this video, I am playing the game on Switch via NSO, or Nintendo Switch Online, just for the convenience of picture quality and save states and whatnot. And I kid you not, one of my favorite ways to play this game is actually using the SNES controller, since its more rounded form factor is just more comfortable in my hands than the NES controller. Maybe it's my nostalgia speaking, but this thing is just the best controller for 2D games. So if you've got one and are playing on Switch, this is the way to go. I know I made a stink back in the day about recording off an actual N64 when talking about Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask, but this is just emulation, not a remake with egregious changes that undermine the atmosphere and mechanics of the game like some of these other ones. But I digress. There is no shortage of ways to play this game. My recommendation is doing it in a way in which you can use save states if possible. And hey, it never hurts to look up a map, since the overworld map that the game gives you is, whatever this is. Or hey, you can draw your own if you want. But there are plenty of guides around the internet, and for a game as cryptic as the original Legend of Zelda, there's no shame in resorting to that. Another note I have touched on at the onset of each new game is the trend of what I call chores to do before getting to each dungeon. In that regard, Zelda 1 is excellent. I love the overworld design here. It really is at its core about pure, unfiltered exploration for exploration's sake, and I love that. It's also worth a mention that even though each dungeon is numbered, you don't necessarily have to do them in that order. I will for this video, but you technically don't have to, with the exception of level 9, which must be done last, and level 3, which has to be done before level 4, so that you can get the raft. Otherwise, it's pretty much all up to you. So the TLDR here is that before the dungeon, you just gotta get to the dungeon, which in a game as cryptic and combat heavy as this can be a challenge in its own right. Alright, cool. With that out of the way, let's head into the dungeons of The Legend of Zelda. Zelda 1's dungeons feel a bit rudimentary in many ways, but they do a lot of things pretty well, often having multiple routes or optional paths. The game exists basically on a grid, and there's no variety whatsoever in room size or shape, so each room is this same 7x12 rectangle. So the challenge here comes in two forms instead. Rather than room-to-room puzzles, you have navigation and combat. The combat in Zelda 1 can be absolutely grueling at times. It often throws overwhelming groups of enemies at you, and it starts doing it pretty early on. Why am I fighting 8 Darknuts at once in the 3rd dungeon? So the combat is basic, but punishing, and this could actually be a point of contention for me with this game. Zelda 1 doesn't exactly do difficulty balancing very well. The game is at its hardest at the very beginning and very end of the game. The middle section is strangely easier in this regard, as you find and collect goodies to round out Link's arsenal, and then it gets really hard again very suddenly. Most of the navigation comes down to keys and locked doors. The dungeons will often present branching paths, one of which will have the key for the other. Take the first dungeon, the Eagle, for example. In this very first room, there are 3 doors, one of them being locked, so by exploring either of the side rooms, you'll find a key. This concept is pretty simple, but variations and iterations of it basically make up the backbone of most dungeons in the series. They just tend to shake things up well enough that you don't notice how simple a concept it really is. is. It's simple, but it encourages you to be curious and explore each dungeon thoroughly, and I like that. Even this early on in the series, that sense of curiosity and discovery is so alive in this game. However, the issue with how Zelda 1 pulls this off comes down to two things: the puzzles, or lack thereof, and the key disparity. Let's start with the puzzles. Puzzles are a staple of the series. They're baked into the DNA of Zelda by this point. But in Zelda 1, almost all of the room-to-room puzzles are just pushing a single block. They hadn't quite figured this part out yet, and so this one single block puzzle ends up getting reused a lot. And it just isn't really that interesting. So that's an idea that would come to fruition in later games. That key disparity is a whole other issue. We tend to think of Zelda dungeons as being self-contained levels, and games after this one would make it so that you can only use a key within the dungeon that it's found in. That is not the case in Zelda 1. Some dungeons have too many keys, and some have not enough. And all of that gets tossed out the window anyways if you find the magical key in level 8, since that acts as a reusable key that can open any door. Or in other words, it's like the game just giving you unlimited keys. The magical key isn't too egregious since it's found right at the end of the penultimate dungeon, and it's pretty well hidden. But in other cases, if you're not thorough enough, you could end up running short on keys and having to leave the dungeon you're in just to backtrack to a previous dungeon and see if there's a key you missed there. Hypothetically, at least. It's never happened to me. Or you could grind for cash and buy one from a shop, but money is not so easy to come by in this game, so that is definitely not my recommended solution. There are simply better ways to spend your rupees. The overworlds of Zelda games being sandboxes with important locations that you'll visit frequently is something I'm totally okay with. I like that about the series, but I prefer not to have to revisit a dungeon once I'm done there. It feels like that defeats the point of it somehow. It's why I detest that one treasure chest in Twilight Princess's Goron Mines, which you need the claw shot for, and it was a huge complaint that I had in Skyward Sword when you had to revisit Skyview Temple. The good news here in Zelda 1 is that there isn't anything you absolutely have to come back for in theory if you're good enough at exploring. Not like that Twilight Princess example where you absolutely cannot get that chest without a future dungeon item, or that Skyward Sword example where it is critical to progression in the story overall. But still, one dungeon simply shouldn't rely on the keys of another, in my opinion. When I finished level 1, I had explored the entire place, but I left with a key still in my pocket. Then I went and finished level 2 and found that it too had an excess key, so I had 2 now. You can see where I'm going with this. It happened again in level 3, so by the time I got to level 4, I was walking in with 3 keys already in my possession. I found everything in the dungeon and left with only 2, which means that level 4 is actually short a key. Same goes for level 7. Level 5, meanwhile, also had an excess key. So that means level 6 and 8 are the only dungeons that have the correct amount of keys to corresponding locked doors in them. And that is if you're not counting the magical key. If you are, then level 8 has effectively unlimited keys, so who cares anyways, right? But if you're doing these dungeons out of order, then that issue is going to be even more prevalent. Imagine doing level 8 first and then never having to hunt for a key in any of the other dungeons. And of course, you can avoid spending some keys on certain locked doors by taking advantage of bombable walls. But this is hedging your bets on knowing which walls are destructible and which aren't. Level 9... Level 9, meanwhile, is such a nightmare to navigate that if you don't have all of the upgrades and that magical key, then you're simply not going to have a good time. This dungeon is bonkers, and I always dread exploring it. But there is more to dungeon design than just locks and keys. There are layouts, puzzles, and items to consider. We've already touched on the lack of puzzles, though. As far as dungeon layouts go, I feel the game sometimes suffers a bit in that regard as well. It's inconsistent though. It feels as though the designers were more interested in arranging the rooms in specific shapes than they were in making the dungeon's layouts coherent. Then to make up for this, they have to connect certain areas with underground passageways, which feels like a band-aid solution to something that could have been avoided in the first place. Other games do this passageway thing too, most notably Link's Awakening and the Oracle games, but it never feels as cryptic in those games. Maybe that's just because they make those passageways more distinct and memorable in in those later games. It's really not bad initially. In fact, you won't even find one of these passageways that connects to other rooms until level 5. But then by the time we get to level 9, the game feels like it has become overly reliant on this idea. I certainly don't mind the concept, especially for secrets, but in order to get through level 9, you'll need to cross through at least 5 of these passageways. Secrets and shortcuts are one thing, but for the critical path to be so cryptic, it certainly is one of those ideas that feels quite antiquated. And these navigational challenges could feel more forgivable if the game wasn't so punishing with its combat, especially when you have rooms crawling with tough enemies like dark nuts that keep respawning. There are plenty more famous examples of these terribly cryptic things. Look at the Hungry Goria as one example. How would you know to buy him some meat? Really. But beyond those famous examples, there is an overabundance of hiding critical items and things behind bombable walls, which unlike later games, don't have any way of telling that they are destructible or distinguishing them from regular walls. They don't show any cracks and can't be sword tapped, so it really just becomes a game of trial and error. And sorry, trial and error of just bombing every wall isn't fun. It's more forgivable in Metroid, where you have unlimited bombs and can drop them away faster, but here it just feels like such a chore, and with how limited bombs are, it feels like a huge risk anytime you do it. Take for example that aforementioned magical key. It's hidden at the very far end of level 8, and while you theoretically can get by without it, it's hidden in such a way that would be entirely too easy to miss out on, since it and even the dungeon map is hidden behind a bombable wall at a fork in the road. You could pass by the map and magical key and end up heading straight for the boss and then moving on without even realizing. Actually, missing dungeon items could be a serious issue for new players, especially for dungeons like level 1 and 8, which have multiple dungeon items like the boomerang and bow, or the book of magic and that magical key. And almost none of the dungeon items are needed for the bosses or level progression of the dungeons that they're found in. You find the bow in level 1 and then have to use it to kill Goma, the boss of level 6, and even then you have to go and buy arrows separately. And why do they take up money to use? And I can think of 0 times that the magic rod is actually mandatory. The big notable exception to all of this is in level 4, where you need to find the ladder to cross this room and reach the boss fight, and level 5, in which the whistle will be needed to fight the boss Digdogger. Dodger, however it's pronounced. Even then, that whistle is pretty well hidden, so you could end up at the boss fight without it. Future Zelda games would use a formula to fix this, by adding a boss key so that you can't get to the boss early, and then needing the dungeon item to even reach said boss key, or by having said item act as a solution to a puzzle that would allow you to progress further. Basically like combining the boss key and dungeon item into one. I like that level 4 plays with the concept a bit, but everywhere else it just feels too easy to accidentally move on. It's this cryptic stuff that can be a real barrier for many people to go back to this game. Zelda as a series is known for having a plethora of secrets, but this game is filled with terrible hints and an overall lack of consistent design philosophy, and it can make the experience a little painful for some. Like really, just try and put yourself in the position of someone who has never played a Zelda game before and doesn't already have first-hand knowledge of these tropes and ideas. Critical paths at times are simply too well hidden, especially when there's gaps in the map. Yeah, I said it. There are multiple times in which there are rooms that are just simply not on the dungeon map. Usually it's for treasure and optional secrets, but level 9 has the worst examples of these. There are 3 rooms not shown on the map at all, and they are all important. One has the red ring, which will bolster your defense, one has the compass, and the third is where Zelda is, so that's the end goal. Granted, if you find the compass, at least the room with Zelda gets highlighted, but that's if you can find the damn compass, because it's hidden behind another damn bombable wall. Look, Most bombable walls in this game are okay, as you can see via the map that there is a room to find adjacent to the one you're in with no discernible way of reaching it, so you have to puzzle that out. And that's cool, especially when they're consistently in the center of the wall. But when there is no room on the map and no telegraphed bombable wall, then that is when it starts to become an issue for me. And of course, we always have to talk about the dungeon bosses. It's nice to see this concept rear its head so early on in the series, and I love the diversity of visual designs here, but I don't have a lot else to say about them overall. I like that Dig Dodger, Goma, and the Dodongos are fought using items other than just your sword, but usually the bosses are just kind of pushovers. Gleeok and Aquamentus just need to be stabbed a bunch, and Manhandla is unfortunately a total joke. One well-placed bomb and he's done for. Couple this with the game just recycling bosses, and unfortunately the game suffers a bit in that department. Ganon himself is also a bit underwhelming if you know what you're doing. If you don't know what you're doing, then he's a real pain. You absolutely need to find the silver arrows before taking him on. But then when you fight him, he turns invisible and you have to just stab around yourself erratically in the hopes that you might end up hitting him. I'm sorry, that's not very fun, fair, or interesting in terms of design. And of course, when you do end up landing a strike by happenstance, you can deal the final blow with a silver arrow, and wow, that's a pretty horrific way to die even with these graphics. So yeah, not much to say here in regards to the boss fights themselves, but it is annoying that you can reach this final room without having the silver arrows, which are essential to defeating Ganon. So those are the dungeons of The Legend of Zelda. I know there are people who are going to say I'm being too hard on this game or that I'm being hypocritical. After all, I just praised Tunic in a previous video for pretty much all the same reasons that I'm criticizing this game. And the truth is that I actually really like Zelda 1. For all these complaints, I really do genuinely enjoy playing this game, I promise. But I can enjoy it and also acknowledge that it has its issues. The difference between Tunic and this game is that while Tunic is bursting with mystery, it at least gives you the tools to solve those mysteries, even if you have to work for it. Zelda 1, not as much. I can totally just get through it and enjoy a playthrough because I know this game. I'm very familiar with it. I don't even know how I know this game so well. I just do. Maybe it's a byproduct of me being a younger sibling in a household full of people who played these games. I gained Zelda knowledge through osmosis or something. It's the same way I just know where to find some one-ups in Super Mario Bros, and it's how I know that there's a heart container behind this wall out in the overworld. But if you don't already know, then finding out is going to be a serious ordeal, or you can just use a guide. I don't know. I genuinely recommend either finding or making a map while you play this game, and taking notes of things, mental or otherwise, because the samey designs and lack of variety in architecture of the rooms in this game means that things are bound to start blending together and get confusing, so it's your best bet really. But still, despite all of its flaws, The Legend of Zelda truly is a charming little adventure. It feels a little unrefined, but it absolutely sets the groundwork that the rest of the series would build itself upon, and I personally can find a lot to love and appreciate here because of that. It isn't as strongly executed here, but those concepts of dungeon items being used as keys to open gates Metroid style, like I talked about in my Metroid design video, and dungeons becoming self-contained experiences with more variety are all things that would end up being refined and pretty well perfected by the time of A Link to the Past, Link's Awakening, and Ocarina of Time. But they all have their roots here, even if its execution is a bit inconsistent. So overall, The Legend of Zelda is not a perfect game, but it's one I always enjoy revisiting for a bit of nostalgia and challenge, and its dungeons would serve as groundwork for better things to come. Thank you so much for watching this video. Before we end this off, I just wanted to take a moment to say thank you to my patrons and channel members, including, but not limited to, Greymage, Brenda, Tetra, Callie, Gail, Hylian Wes, Justin, Clifford Longhead, Midnight Naomi, and Bunny. Thank you all so much for the support and for watching, and I will catch you all next time. Bye-bye!